Movies and TV shows often depict life in a castle as a magical and fantastical experience. They portray the inhabitants as noble and privileged individuals. However, the reality was quite different. Castles were gloomy, damp, and unpleasant strongholds infested with pests and diseases. Today, we will delve into the true conditions of living in a medieval castle. If you were fortunate enough to belong to the ruling class, you could enjoy indulging in luxurious wine and occasionally taking a hot bath. However, overall, there was little comfort or relaxation to be found, except for attending church and inflicting cruel torture upon enemies. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Interesting Day. During medieval times in Europe, having a proper plumbing system was nothing more than a distant dream. This means that there was no running water and absolutely no way to flush a toilet. Instead, all waste would collect in a large cesspool beneath the toilets, essentially turning every castle into a huge outdoor restroom. Now, imagine this outdoor restroom on the hottest day of summer. But it wasn't just the constant smell of feces that made castle life unpleasant. The lack of running water meant no baths, unless you were extremely wealthy. As a result, all the servants in the castle would be running around smelling as bad as my old gym bag. Moreover, the servants couldn't afford proper medicine like the lords and nobles could. So, the average person living in a castle would be walking around very sick, relying on home remedies or praying to God for a cure. Speaking of toilets, privacy was not something you could expect in a castle unless you were the owner. When you needed to use the bathroom, you would have to do your business on a long wooden bench with several holes cut into it, in full view of your friends, co-workers, and anyone else passing by. There was no flushing either, so everything would just drop into a massive pit of horrors inside the castle. You know how crowded the house gets when one or two relatives come to visit. Now imagine multiplying that by 100, and that's what it was like to live in a castle. Castles required many servants just to handle the day-to-day tasks, not to mention the multiple generations of the lord and lady's families living there, along with all their personal servants. Living in a castle was like living in a small and crowded city, all focused on meeting the needs of a single family. We've all seen enough fantasy movies and cartoons to know that castles had dungeons where the lord and lady could throw criminals, political opponents, or anyone who offended them. However, what they often leave out in those movies is that these prisoners were regularly subjected to gruesome torture. One particularly cruel method involved letting hungry rats eat the prisoner alive from the inside out. And while we're talking about rats, dealing with them can be quite challenging even in modern times. Now, imagine what it was like living in a huge, dark, and damp castle without any modern traps or pest control. Rats were everywhere, and there wasn't much one could do about them. People simply accepted rat infestation as a normal part of life, like a common car model of that era. You might think that people would eventually get used to the rats, but many medieval folks were extremely afraid of them. It didn't help that rats were frequently used for torture or that they carried a plague that wiped out about half of Europe's population around that time. At this point, it probably won't surprise you to learn that people living in castles liked to drink alcohol. It was the best way to endure the day in an overcrowded and foul-smelling house infested with rats. Lords and ladies could enjoy a variety of fine wines, beers, and spirits, but the servants had to settle for whatever they could find. Drinking alcohol was actually safer than consuming water, as most water sources were contaminated. With all the drinking happening, one might assume that most people in a castle wouldn't wake up until noon. However, that was mainly true for the lords, as the servants had to start working as soon as the sun rose. Since electricity didn't exist back then, sunlight was crucial. Castles were dark places, even during the day, so the servants had to take advantage of every moment of sunlight to complete their tasks. Even if you didn't work in a castle, unless you were wealthy, chances are you had a job as a merchant, craftsman, or laborer, which required waking up early to earn a living. Contrary to what many believe, people in medieval times actually enjoyed taking baths, just like they do today. The only problem was that finding clean water, especially for those in the lower class, was quite challenging. We can't emphasize enough how important plumbing is in this regard. The bath itself was like a comically large wooden bucket that could be moved from room to room in the castle for people to bathe in. It wasn't exactly hygienic or private, but at least it allowed them to wash away some of the castle's unpleasant odors. Castles were essentially massive basements with little insulation. They were primarily designed as fortresses rather than comfortable homes. Everything was made of cold stone, and the few windows didn't let in much sunlight. The lords and ladies had nicer rooms with fireplaces and windows, but the servants' quarters were often located in the lower, interior parts of the castles. These areas were freezing, dark spaces that provided the perfect conditions for diseases to thrive in the damp cold. At that point, sleeping outside might have been a more appealing option. As we've discussed before, castles were basically smelly piles of stones. To try and keep the castle somewhat clean, they would spread rushes, reeds, and herbs on the floor. These plants would soak up any unsightly spills and hopefully hide some of the really bad smells. Replacing the old rushes with clean ones was a difficult task, similar to moving a dead body, because it would reveal all the disgusting things like beer, grease, scraps, bones, saliva, and waste from dogs and cats. Basically, no matter where you went in the castle, you were walking on a thin layer of hidden filth. The Middle Ages were a tough time, so even the best-case scenario of living in a castle was pretty much a miserable experience. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining us on Interesting Day. See you next time.